She led the New York State Action Coalition in constructing the 2014 Workforce Diversity Toolkit for New York. She's a fellow at the New York Academy of Medicine, Academy of Nursing Education, this is a mouthful, and an American Academy of Nursing, and she serves on the editorial board for the American Journal of Nursing as well. Dr. Kenya, not a mustache, is going to be talking to us about diversity and inclusion, so leading on very well from what Steph was just talking about. Dr. Kenya, over to you. Thank you. Just the green button.
Good afternoon. How's everyone? It is truly an honor to be here today. One, to talk about something that's very near and dear to me, diversity and inclusion. And two, an honor and on behalf of Adtalem to accept the Gold Award for inspiring diversity and inclusion. So, thank you. So, why is diversity and inclusion so important? Turn to the person next to you in one sentence. Tell them why diversity and inclusion is so incredibly important. One sentence. Okay, so why is D&I so incredibly important? Over here, anyone want to share why you believe it's so important? The future. I love it. Yes, because we have greater diversity now more than ever, and we're getting more diverse as we progress. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? Understanding different perspectives, because that's what usually leads us towards excellence. High five. Anyone else?
I think that creating diversity really drives innovation, difference of opinion, difference of thought, different ways of perceiving things.
Yes. So it drives innovation. Can I hug you? She said, I think it's morally the right thing to do. Thank you for saying that. It's a reflection of the world.
I also think there's more than enough for everyone.
I love it. There's more than enough for everyone. For me, when I think about D&I work, I think about my grandfather. About 30 years ago, he was retired, and he was volunteering, picking up stray animals. And one day he came home and he said to my grandmother, my back, I think I lifted up one of the dogs and it was just too heavy, and I pulled out my back. But if you pull your back, it should heal in a matter of weeks. But for my grandfather, the pain got worse, but he would not go to see a provider. You know why? Because my grandfather was born around the time of the Tuskegee experiment, and he didn't trust providers. So he stayed home, loaded up on the Motrin until his stomach couldn't bear it anymore, and then finally he found himself in the emergency room with a provider that did not look like him and couldn't understand why he waited so long when he shared the X-ray report that he had a huge mass on his back, and it looked like cancer. Well, the biopsy was done, and it was confirmed. He had lung cancer, and he was given 3 months to live, and he died in 2. So when I tell you how important diversity and inclusion is to me, I come at it from a different perspective. I come at it in healthcare as a way to make sure that every person who seeks healthcare knows that providers do care. But do we always show it? Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we struggle with that. So I want to begin by sharing a quote, and I want you to guess the year that you believe that this quote was written. Are you ready? Today's physicians, nurses, and dentists have too little resemblance to the diverse populations they serve, leaving many Americans feeling excluded by a system that seems distant and uncaring. Failure to reverse these trends could place the health of at least 1/3 of the nation's citizens at risk. Tell the person sitting next to you, what year do you believe those words were written? All right, did you say 2022? Did you say 5 years ago? 10 years ago? Close. So these words are from the Sullivan Commission report, 2003. And it was from a report entitled Missing Persons, Minorities in the Health Professions. I'm sad to say not much has changed. The Sentinel report charged leaders in the health professions to counter the lack of diversity and open their doors to access. And at Adtalem, that's exactly what we did. We know that operationalizing the values of diversity and inclusion is critical to improving healthcare outcomes. What do you think is the leading cause of death in the United States? Heart disease. What do you think is the second leading cause of death? Cancer. What do you think is the third leading cause of death? According to the Johns Hopkins study, medical errors. So if you have been in the hospital or you have a family member right now in the hospital, you might be concerned. So as a leader in diversity and social mission, I know that so much has been done to dismantle racism in healthcare and higher education. Yet so much more is needed to inspire diversity and inclusion. The horrific murder of Mr. George Floyd painfully amplified injustices in all corners of the world, from education to employment to healthcare and transportation. His death served as a catalyst that ignited a call for social justice and mobilized a nation of workers, students, and activists to stand up, to rise, and demand accountability. The war on injustice is a battle that has been fought for centuries, and it continues. And when I reflect on Dr. King's words, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, I am deeply inspired. He emphasized in the book, Where Do We Go From Here?, that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability. Rather, it comes through continuous struggle every day. So how do we override the forces that limit efforts to inspire diversity and inclusion? Through activism, the advancement of inclusive admission policies, and purposeful education policies that create a culture that invites difference. While Adtalem Global Education is committed to widening access by dismantling obstacles that prevent access to higher education, this work is so much greater than one person, greater than one organization, and requires a collective effort. And that is why I'm so proud to be part of the Adtalem community. As the Associate Provost for Social Mission and Academic Excellence at Chamberlain University, we are the largest nursing school in the United States. How many of you know a nurse? Raise your hand. It's pretty hard not to know a nurse with the largest discipline in healthcare. And don't you love the nurses? Not to brag on nurses, but who here does not love nurses? And if you do, raise your hand and I will let them know if you have, no, just joking. All right, so our organization has a well-defined mission. We provide global access to knowledge that transforms lives and enables careers. And I am proud that our social mission is the backbone of all that we do. Injustices and inequities, we know they contribute to healthcare disparities and startling mortality rates. I live in New York. I remember a very sad story about a 5-year-old, and we'll call her Lisa. Lisa just moved to an area in the Bronx with her mother and just excited to be in this new complex. But every week, Lisa had an asthmatic attack at school, and she had to go back to the hospital 5 times in 1 month. The 6th time Lisa had an asthmatic attack, she had a period of anoxia that left her brain damaged, and she died. When I share that story across the country, every nurse knows a Lisa. How is that possible? When we think about Lisa's senseless death, and I ask, how did she die? Why did she die? Where was the intervention before the 5th, 6th time that she ended up in the hospital? And we could do a lot of finger pointing, right? A lot of bias surfaces, what our beliefs and attitudes are. But the reality of the story is, most people don't know the backdrop. Most people don't know that Lisa lived in a part of the Bronx called Asthma Alley, where if you Google search right now, it is the area of the Bronx in New York that has the worst air quality, the absolute worst. So every day when Lisa got up and went to work or went to school and played or went to church, she was exposed to a very toxic air. That's what contributed to her death. Not her mother doing or not doing something, not the nurses or the providers doing or not doing something, but our system failing to recognize how social determinants play a role in one's outcomes. So typically, healthcare education has been a linear process focused on disease prevention, early identification, treatment, and then management. But when we fail to consider how poverty, how structural racism, how upstream factors undermine our ability to achieve the highest level of health, we enter practice and treat individuals with one arm tied behind our back. Now, I understand we do not have a consensus when discussing racism in this country. However, James Baldwin said it best: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's faced. Students must learn, and providers must recognize and understand the broader issues contributing to healthcare outcomes. So historically, the nursing profession and other disciplines have mainly ignored the devastating impact that racism has on health outcomes. However, this year, a lot of key leaders got together and we produced a report, a foundational report, called Racism in Nursing. And we have rolled up our sleeves and we've done a lot of hard work to say, we inherited this mess. We did not cause it, but we can do something about it. So how can we address structural racism in a way that empowers us to move forward and does not stifle us or create this bubble of chaos and discontent and despair? How can we undo the normalization and legitimization of policies and practices that generated a healthcare workforce that remains largely homogeneous in a culturally diverse society? So, representation matters. We know that patients are more likely offered, they're more likely to accept evidence-based care, and they're more likely to have better health outcomes when paired with a physician of the same race. However, the AAMC reported in 2018 that only 5% of physicians are Black. And we make up 13% of the US population. And 90% of all US med schools graduate 20 or fewer Black physicians each year. This imbalance between the supply and demand of healthcare workers and the diversity of the workforce, not reflecting the gender and or racial diversity of the United States, is a critical issue that we are solving. What's more, in the healthcare industry, data shows that women are more likely to survive serious health conditions like heart attacks when what? When they are treated by female physicians. Yet, when we look at the physician talent pipeline, women have been largely underrepresented among med school graduates. The Kaiser Family Foundation reported this year that only 37% of physicians are female. Now, that's a huge rise, but we still have a long way to go. At the same time, we know women make up 51% of the US populations, and the numbers just don't add up. But the work that we are doing across Adtalem will help to correct this imbalance. So how do we inspire diversity and inclusion? We start with the top. Under the leadership of Adtalem's former CEO, Lisa Wardell, one of the few Black female leaders of publicly traded companies, she used her lived experience and lens to instill high intentional values and programs and infuse diversity and inclusion throughout the DNA of Adtalem. Today, our president and CEO, Stephen Beard, no relation, carries forth these important values with great momentum. He has been bold about our commitments to fill the need for a more diverse healthcare workforce and help address disparities within the United States healthcare system. And we pursue this commitment and responsibility every day with great urgency and care. A true commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity extends both internally and externally. Our mission needs to be at the heart of an institution and authentically carried through in every interaction, every admission, and every decision that we make. We stand for equity and social justice, but how we activate this is more important. We know that representation matters. Adtalem actively worked to set the standard and lead by example for global companies. A specific focus of these efforts was to look at diversity in our leadership. So we started at the top and we infused it through Adtalem and at every level of the company. One, we eliminated the requirement for board appointees to have a prior board experience. This was a requirement that has historically kept people of color and women from being considered for board seats in the past. And then two, tying managers' performance goals to diversity initiatives and including the recruitment of women and people of color. So this is hard work, and the most important thing is to look in the mirror and ask, what are you doing to address systemic challenges? So if leaders are not steering the ship toward diversity, the one or two oars that we try to use to propel us forward will be lost in a riptide that submerges the ideals of DEI deeply beneath the sea of inequity. So besides the Adtalem board and leaders, students must be diverse as well. We intentionally open our doors to students who are underrepresented in higher education. As the leading healthcare educator and provider of professional talent to the healthcare industry, we are committed to helping solve the critical shortages. At Walden University, women are leading the way, making up more than 3/4 of our student population. At AUC and Ross University School of Medicine, we address this by increasing the diversity of our med school students, and in 2022, 26% of our medical school graduates were from a racial or ethnic group. And at our Ross University School of Veterinary Medicine, we are recognized as a leader in diversifying the field of veterinary medicine. At Chamberlain, we realize our country's critical healthcare needs can be met by a skilled workforce. And according to the Journal of Nursing Regulation, approximately 20% of the nursing workforce identifies with an ethnic or racial group, and Chamberlain has been increasing that number. So we are committed to diversity and inclusion, but what does the practice of it look like? As part of Chamberlain and all of Adtalem's institutions' collective commitment to DE&I work, we provide an education to our students that's rooted in inclusivity and understanding. And at Chamberlain, we created the social determinants of learning. This is a framework which includes actionable steps to identify educational disparities, to mitigate barriers, and increase access to education. The framework helps us to identify factors that may affect a student's ability to succeed, and it prompts us to examine the physical or psychosocial health of our students, the physical environment. And basically, when we look at this, we now know that if a student is struggling to get to clinical, if they have to take 3 buses, then something's wrong with this picture, and what are we doing about it? So we are making a difference. We're making sure that we ensure diverse representation at every level of our organization. And we know in 2019, we were the first higher ed institution to sign up on the HBC Partnership Challenge, and we pledged to invest in creating strategic collaborations with historically Black colleges and universities, and we worked to increase diversity in key workforce settings. So we know that racism has been declared a public health crisis and a driver of health disparities. It's an intentional focus on diversity and inclusion like ours that is no longer optional. We have to recognize the fallout of racism and how it impacts all of us. One lesson that was so aptly characterized on social media highlighted how we are all in the same storm. However, we most definitely are not all in the same boat. We became painfully aware of systemic gender inequities that led to the She Session, which was coined by the President and Chief Executive of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, Nicole Mason. We saw women were inordinately affected, and women who identified as Black fared the worst of all racial groups. For the women and men who remained in the workforce, many struggled to balance life's competing priorities. But while the pandemic has seemingly widened the gender and racial parity gap, it served as a pivotal opportunity for corporate America to be highly intentional about D&I. So we know companies that choose to prioritize gender equality experience revenue growth, and that's important. We also know that inclusion extends beyond race. At Adtalem, we are committed to inclusion regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Adtalem also has a long history of supporting military servicemen and women by employing hundreds of veterans and reservists. And in closing, at a time when public health is a priority and health equity is imperative, we must continue to face change head on, and find new ways to improve the health of our nation. Diversity is critical to improving healthcare, yet diversity is not a panacea for all that ails healthcare. By addressing inequities, by focusing on implicit bias, not just today, but tomorrow as well, and racism, both intentionally and externally, Adtalem will continue to make a bold impact on the healthcare landscape. We know that we are not on this journey alone, and we hope that our story will inspire you to a closer commitment to diversity and inclusion. Thank you.